The wind had a voice, and tonight it sang a slow, aching hymn across the worn stone walls of the citadel. Frost clung to the old mortar like a second skin, thickening in silence, settling into every forgotten edge and shadow. Above, the towers watched the stars with patient, frosted brows, ancient and unmoved, while below, life inside the fortress simmered in the slow heat of candlelight, of memory, and of quiet endurance. No one alive knew the citadel's true name. Anymore, it was once called something noble, perhaps carved proudly into marble gates, now lost to ivy and moss. But those who still lived within called it only the walls. And those who had left, if they still lived at all, never spoke of it again. The year had curved once more into deep winter. Snow had sealed the outer courtyard in a pale hush. Wooden carts stood abandoned beneath awnings weighed with frost. Stone steps groaned with each gust, and in the kitchen, down the hall behind a crooked archway of discolored brick, a pot of barley and dried onion simmered over a smouldering pit. Watched by eyes that had watched too many seasons go by, old Markian sat wrapped in 3 cloaks and a wool hood, rocking slightly on his stool beside the fire. He didn't sleep much anymore. He liked the sounds of the broth bubbling. He liked the feel of the stone under his soles and the flicker of smoke curling upward like a small spirit returning to the sky. Mostly, he liked knowing that the others would wake and smell something warm. It gave the walls meaning. The hearth beside him had been built long before his time built. He always said, when emperors still rode past the gates on horseback and banners snapped red and gold under a Constantinople, "Son, that was before the city died, before the emperors faded into dust, before the church bells stopped ringing and the maps stopped caring. Now no one sent letters, no traders came, no soldiers marched. The fortress sat on a hill the world had forgotten. And yet inside, people still breathed. They still lit fires. They still made bread in the cloisters above the main hall." Brother Petros laid another log onto the brazier, then rubbed his cracked hands together. He had once been a monk in the imperial court, a tall, lean figure with a sharp nose and fingers always stained with ink. Now he was just Petros, caretaker of old scrolls in a library that hadn't been replenished since the emperor's 3rd cousin had fled with the last working donkey. By day, he kept the books from crumbling. By night, he watched the frost creep along the inside of the stained glass window above the chapel, forming petals and stars that slowly vanished with sunrise. He didn't complain. He had vowed to stay. After all, long ago, when the outer villages still had names and the roads were safe enough for pilgrims. Below him, through a stone passage lined with dripping moss, the central dormitory held 12 sleeping bodies, all huddled under cloaks and stitched blankets. A soft harmony of breathing rose and fell across the chamber, the rhythm of life untouched by time. There were women, men, 3 children, and a hound so old he didn't bark any more, just watched with yellowed eyes and wagged his tail once in a while, mostly in dreams. The youngest child, Lydian, slept closest to the brazier. His mother, Doria, always made sure of it. She'd lost her husband in the 2nd winter after the siege, when the cold took him faster than fever ever could. Lydian had been 2 then. Now he was 5, and full of strange questions that even Petros couldn't answer. Why doesn't the snow stop falling? He had asked the week before. Doria hadn't answered. There was no reason. The sky simply wept its silence down each year, and the people inside the walls simply braced against it. In the east wing, where The frescoes still clung stubbornly to the curved apse of an old chapel. Two women named Talia and Ismin kept the candles trimmed. They lived in the choir's former chamber, now stuffed with firewood, salvaged wool, and bundles of dried herbs they collected in the summer. Talia once sang in the Cathedral of Trebizond. Ismin had come from the southern islands, though she spoke little of her past. Now they moved like phantoms through the stone halls, whispering songs to each other at night while they work, keeping the darkness gentle, warming the air with voices soft as feathers. Each chamber in the fortress had its own rhythm, its own memory, its own flicker of stubborn warmth. The bathhouse, long abandoned, had become a sanctuary for drying clothes. The old bakery was now a chicken coop, though the hens had stopped laying months ago. The armory held no weapons, any more just rusted blades and broken shafts draped in cobwebs. But even there, under a patch of collapsed ceiling, someone had planted winter onions in a pot. And each day, someone checked to see if they had grown. They hadn't, not yet, but someone always checked, once a week. If the snow allowed, Brother Petros and Doria walked to the top of the eastern watchtower. The stairs were narrow, worn smooth by centuries of feet, and at the top, the wind blew sharp against the face like the blade of a forgotten sword. But from there, they could see the forest far below, black trees swaying under white coats, and the long ribbon of frozen river curling along the horizon. On clear days, a mountain could be glimpsed, bluish and cruel. They said beyond it lay another town, perhaps a village, perhaps nothing. Still, Doria looked every time, and every time Petros said the same thing. If there is someone left out there, they'll see the smoke from our fires. If they still look, Doria would answer. But mostly they just stood. In silence, there was no more bell to ring in the tower. The clapper had cracked long ago, and no one had found the iron to repair it. But Petros still checked the mechanism sometimes, adjusting the ropes, brushing snow from the wooden wheel. He said it mattered, that the citadel deserved dignity, even if its voice was gone. By nightfall, the air inside the fortress thickened, with the scent of barley and wax, smoke and wool. Children curled closer to the hearth. Lydian pressed his ear against his mother's chest and listened to her heartbeat like a lullaby. The dog stirred but didn't move. An old Markian muttered to himself something about the emperor's cook and a pigeon pie from 30 winters ago. Outside, the frost deepened. Snow pressed against the walls, shifting with the wind, testing the stone like a patient beast. Inside, Petros lit another lamp. Doria stirred the pot. Talia sang softly, and the fortress held. It didn't speak, but it remembered. It didn't shine, but it breathed. And in a world that had gone quiet, the walls still dreamed. Snowfall had thickened through the night, and by morning, the outer gate stood buried beneath a smooth white drift, soft as flour and just as silent. No footsteps marked the courtyard. No birds flew above the ramparts. The sky itself had settled into a pewter hush, weighed heavy with clouds that neither broke nor passed. It was as though the world had paused between breaths and forgotten to exhale. Inside the walls, the day began not with bells or the shout of morning merchants, but with the slow cracking of wood. A branch from the old apricot tree had split under the snow's weight, falling across the courtyard with a low, hollow thud that echoed down the stone passageways like the closing of a distant door. Markian heard it in the kitchen, but didn't rise. He knew the tree. He had planted it with his brother, before the siege, before the last grain ships had vanished from the coast. He would check it later, After the coals were stirred, Talia was already awake. She moved barefoot through the chapel's eastern wing, her breath misting as she passed the long-forgotten saints on the wall, their faces blurred by time and lichen. She reached for the brass lamp near the altar and drew it close to the brazier's edge. Her fingers, cracked and red from the cold, held the wick steady while she tilted the flame inward. The wick caught, flared, and settled into a quiet orange. Glowed-up Petros descended from the library with a bundle of wrapped parchment in his arms. The old scribe's shoulders were stooped more deeply now, but his pace never faltered. The scrolls needed warmth, he said, not just the people. Ink turned brittle in this kind of cold. Vellum cracked like dry bark. Every week he rotated the collection by the hearth, reading a few lines aloud to no one in particular, his voice like paper rubbed between hands. This morning he read of stars, and the astrologers of Cherson say the comet foretells a great silence, a long sleep in stone. Lydian listened from behind a stack of barrels, half hidden, his chin resting on his knees. He didn't know what a comet was, but he liked the sound of the words. He liked how they moved like snowflakes, slow and wide, and how they turned the silence into something alive. He sat still until his mother called him. Doria stood at the well. Her arms were bare, braced against the stone lip. A coil of rope wrapped round one wrist. The pulley squeaked as she drew the bucket up, hand over hand, the wood groaning with each inch. She worked quickly before the water could freeze again. Beneath her feet, the flagstones shimmered with rime, and above her, a single icicle hung from the wooden beam, dripping once every minute. Inside the bucket, the water was clean, cold enough to bite, clear enough to see your reflection. She dipped a rag into it, wrung it out, and pressed it to her cheek. Just once. Just enough to remind herself she was still a body, not just a shape moving through stone halls and old. Smoke in the afternoon, they gathered in the great hall. It wasn't grand anymore, no banners, no gilded icons, no long banquet tables, groaning with meat and wine. Just 3 short benches, a hearth in the middle, and a narrow shaft of light falling through the roof where a piece of slate had slipped years ago. Snowflakes drifted down through it like ash. No one bothered to patch the hole. It had become something of a clock. Morning sun angled through it in spring. Stars shone through it in midwinter. The gathered voices were quiet today, mostly whispers, low exchanges over stitching or carving or the weaving of netting they no longer used, but still made out of memory or stubbornness. Doria mended a torn sleeve. Petros recited aloud. Talia sorted dried beans into a bowl by colour, and Marcion, half dozing, told a story to no one about how he once cooked a pigeon that had eaten cloves from the governor's garden, and how it tasted like perfume and regret. In one corner, the hound dozed, twitching in sleep. Someone had set a bowl of boiled oats by the hearth, but no one claimed it. It would go to the chickens if it remained untouched by dusk. Waste wasn't allowed. Even for food no one wanted. Especially for food no one wanted. Later, the snow eased just enough that 2 of the older boys, Aaron and Simos, ventured outside to check the tree. The wind had softened, and the flakes fell lazy now, drifting sideways in slow pirouettes. The apricot tree looked like a broken arm reaching from the ground. Its upper limbs snapped. Its trunk split down the middle. They stood beside it for a long time. Neither had known it was Marcion's tree. Neither had ever tasted an apricot. They returned with the fallen branches. Nothing was said, just bundled and carried, stripped of what bark could be used, placed neatly beside the kitchen for the next night's fire. The silence was not mournful. It was practical. That evening, the citadel changed. It was not dramatic. There was no scream or quake or sudden burst of storm. Just a small sound barely audible beyond the wind's breath. A tapping. Then a knock that the sound came from the outer gate. Doria was the first to hear it. She was in the hallway. Above, tending to the small fire she kept near the grain storage, when the sound traveled upward through the stones. A rhythmic thud. Slow, measured, not the wind. Not ice falling from the roof. A hand, a human hand. She didn't shout. She simply stood, frozen with the coal shovel still in her grip. Her breath caught halfway between inhale and prayer. Then came the second knock. Talia appeared in the archway. Drawn by the stillness, Petros slower leaned from the stairwell. Markian didn't rise, but he watched the doorway. It was the first knock any of them had heard in over 4 winters. When they reached the gate, the snow was waist deep. The outer steps were slick, the iron handle almost fused by ice. They worked quickly, feverishly, breaking the frozen seal around the doors. It took 6 of them to push the bar aside. The doors creaked open, and there, framed in snow and twilight, stood a figure, a girl no older than Lydian, wrapped in rags, her hair matted with snow, barefoot dot, her lips were blue, her eyes were open. Behind her nothing, no tracks, no footprints in the snow. Just white silence stretching backward into the dusk. Doria moved first. She stepped out, lifted the child into her arms, and turned without a word. The others followed inside. Warmth rose in waves as the doors closed behind them. They laid the child near the hearth. Petros brought a cloth. Talia rubbed her feet with oil. Lydian hovered nearby, silent. The girl did not speak, but her breathing was steady. Her eyes closed slowly, like the petals of a frostbitten flower, folding inward again, seeking sleep. And so the citadel grew by one soul. They didn't ask where she came from. Not that night, not even the next. It was enough that she was here. The walls did not protest. They absorbed her the way they absorbed snowmelt, the way they held the warmth of every candle, every name, every breath that still echoed against their stones. That night, the sky cleared above the hole in the great hall's roof. The stars returned cold, white burning. Petros looked up and thought of the scroll he had read earlier, of comets, of silences. Doria sat beside the girl. She brushed a strand of hair from the child's face and whispered something that no one else heard. The hearth crackled. The old hound raised its head, then lowered it again. And somewhere, far away, past the forest, past the frozen river, the wind carried the faintest scent of something alive, of burning wood, of barley broth, of warmth. The walls still held. The walls had not been forgotten. Not yet. The girl did not speak for 3 days. She ate what they offered, drank from the chipped clay cup Doria placed near her cot, and slept so deeply the others took turns checking that her breath still misted in the cold. When she opened her eyes, she looked not at faces but at corner shadows, ceilings, cracks in stone, the drifting coil of steam rising from the hearth. Her name, if she had one, stayed curled behind her lips like a buried seed. Lydian was the first to sit near her. He brought her a small bundle of carved wooden animals, each smoothed and worn at the edges. A dog, a fox, something he claimed was a lion. He didn't speak either. He simply laid them in front of her on the floor, lined them up with quiet, practiced care. and then nodded once before sitting cross-legged and waiting. She looked at them, then at him, then picked up the fox. It was enough. The others gave her space, but their eyes were always watching, kind, tired, cautious. They had seen winters long enough to know that some arrivals came carrying more than frost on their lashes. Marcian muttered that no child wandered so far alone unless something darker pushed her forward. Petros said nothing, but at night he returned to the scrolls that told of signs and seasons, omens and stars. Doria didn't ask questions. She just added more broth to the pot that the citadel, once so quiet, shifted its weight like a sleeping beast adjusting to new breath in its lungs. Even the snow seemed to hold, differently now, heavier on the walls, slower to melt around the narrow paths the children carved between buildings. The great tree, now firewood stacked neatly in the covered passage, gave a faint resin scent when burned, and in the chapel the candle flames danced higher than before, swaying with an unseen rhythm that Ismin called the hushwind. On the fourth day, the girl finally spoke. It was evening. The great hall flickered with low firelight. Marcian had dozed off in his chair again, snoring through his nose in short whistles. Petros recited something under his breath, barely audible, his eyes tracking the words on a scroll that trembled slightly in the draught. Talia was carding wool, and Lydian was pretending to sleep near the hearth, but his fingers still played with the carved lion under his blanket. The girl, who had been sitting cross-legged on the farm mat, simply looked up and whispered one word, Velia. Petros looked up. Doria turned from the kettle. Talia paused, the wool thread going still between her hands. It was not a name anyone recognized, not from the villagers nearby, nor from the imperial records Petros had once copied in gold ink, but it had a weight to it, like something old, something buried. Your name? Doria asked gently, coming close. The girl nodded. Double quotes. Do you remember how you came here? Velia blinked once, slow dot, then shook her head. But later that night, when the hall had quieted and the fire dimmed to soft coals, Lydian whispered to her under his breath, asking what she had seen beyond the woods, beyond the snow. She didn't answer right away. But just before sleep took her, she murmured, I followed the smoke. It was enough. That night, Doria dreamed of fire, not the gentle hearth's warmth, but something grand, wild, a tower of flame rising against a twilight sky. She stood at the top of the watchtower, smoke billowing past her like sails unfurled, and below the world burned. Villages, rivers, even the stars themselves flickered like torches snuffed by wind. When she awoke, the sky was still dark, but the air had changed. Warmer, the frost on the inner walls had softened to dampness. Snowmelt trickled in slow beads from the corners of the roof, and in the courtyard, for the first time in over a month, a raven called out from the branch of the west wall 3 notes, sharp and clear, like a riddle with no answer. Petros claimed. It was a good omen. Marcian spat into the brazier and said, Omens don't keep people warm, but all day. The mood was lighter. YSM opened the shutters near the chapel for half an hour to let the air move. Children threw packed snow at each other, near the edge of the wall, until Doria called them back in. And someone, no one admitted, who left a line of flower petals on the steps near the old bell tower. Wilted, frostbitten petals, probably scavenged from deep under the snow where autumn had once lived. But still color, a whisper of something, not grey. Even the chickens clucked louder that morning, and yet, when night came, a hush fell again. Not fear, but something deeper. Awaiting, Velia sat beside Lydian near the hearth, their feet tucked beneath the same blanket, She watched the flames, her eyes reflecting amber and smoke. And when Talia began to hum softly from across the room a song with no words, only long notes that rose and fell like a tide Valia whispered something that caught Doria's ear. My mother sang that. She looked up. She said it keeps the cold from touching your bones. Talia froze mid-note. Petros's hand stopped mid-scroll. Where was she? Doria asked, voice low. Velia didn't answer. She turned her gaze back to the fire, and the silence closed again like a curtain. That night, the winds rose, but not from the usual north. They came from the east, sharp, bitter, salt-laced, the kind of wind that smelled like ships and old iron and storms born at sea. The kind of wind they hadn't felt since the last merchant vessel passed a decade ago, carrying silks and dried figs and news of uprisings along the coast. Marcian called it a salt wind. He hadn't smelled one since he was a boy that night. The fire was banked carefully, and extra blankets were passed around. Even the dog slept closer to the center of the hall. And as Doria wrapped Velia more tightly in the thickest wool, the girl opened her eyes just once and whispered, "The river's awake." No one asked what she meant, but at dawn the river fog arrived. It came slowly, curling like smoke over the wall's outer edge, sinking low between towers, slipping past doorways and stone stairs with a grace that made no sound. By mid-morning, the citadel was wrapped in mist. Every edge softened, every shadow deepened. The trees below the hill disappeared entirely. Even the watchtower vanished beyond 10 steps. Petros lit 3 extra lamps that day. Doria kept the children close. Marcian swore under his breath and burned sage in the kitchen. Fog was not uncommon, but this was something else. Too dense, too quiet, like a breath held too long. And Velia, she walked through it as if it knew her. She wandered the chapel, stood beneath the bell tower, placed a hand on the wall near the old fresco of the 3 saints with golden eyes, and when she passed the sealed iron gate that led down into the crypts, she paused, only for a heartbeat. But it was long enough for Petros, watching from the stairwell, to feel the hairs on his arms rise. That night, the snow returned, but not as flakes. It came as crystals, hard and dry, tinkling like glass on the stone sills. The air had turned brittle again. The fog was gone, and in its place, silence reigned. But the silence was different now. Not empty, full, heavy with breath, with waiting, with memory inside the hall. The hearth burned low. The scrolls lay untouched. The carved lion sat alone on the stone shelf, and Velia stood by the fire, her hand outstretched, palm facing the flames. She was not warming herself. She was listening. Doria, wrapped in her cloak, watched from her corner and did not move. Neither did the others. Even the hound stayed still, and in the quiet, they all felt it something old, stirring. Beneath the floor, not a sound, not a tremor, but a knowing. The sense that the walls themselves were remembering something. Something buried. Something waiting then, as the last log cracked in the hearth and the embers hissed in reply. Velia turned her face to the stone and whispered, "They're coming." And the wind answered with a single gust, pushing through the shutter slats. Like a sigh. The citadel did not sleep that night, and the fire was never allowed to die. The fire burned through until morning, but no one dared sleep. They didn't speak of it aloud, what they had heard, what they had felt, but it lived beneath every breath. The stone of the citadel, so long settled into familiar groans and creaks, had taken on a different voice In the hours after Valia's whisper, it wasn't a sound. Not really. More like a change in gravity. The air pressed differently against the skin. Shadows fell just slightly longer. Every candle flame tilted toward the eastern walls, as though pulled by something unseen beyond the chapel. Lydian had clutched his lion carving all night, buried beneath Doria's blanket with wide, dry eyes. Petros sat in vigil by the stairwell, watching the corridor that led to the old gate. Marcian stayed by the hearth, unmoving, save for the flick of his eyes toward the windows every few minutes. And Talia, wrapped in her mother's shawl, hummed that same haunting song again, but quieter now, as though it wasn't for them anymore. Valia stood, as she had the night before, facing the stone. Not a word, not a blink, just the stillness of someone waiting for something they already knew was coming. When morning finally pried open the dark sky, it arrived with neither color nor warmth, just a pale diffusion of grey light that washed everything in the same flat hue the floor. The walls, the faces of those gathered in the great hall. No one moved at first. The fear hadn't left. But duty returned with the dawn. Marcian stirred. The coals, Petros poured water into the grain. Talia fetched the cloths for drying hands. Lydian finally exhaled. Doria stood and walked to the door. When she opened it, the courtyard was blanketed against fresh snow, clean as parchment. The fog had lifted entirely, but the silence remained. And more than that, the tracks. There were prints in the snow, not from within the citadel, from outside, long, even strides, deep impressions, each spaced with a precision that was too perfect to be natural, not human, not animal, something else. No heel, no tread, just clean ovals in the snow, one after the other, leading from the tree line straight to the outer gate. They stopped there. No return path, no wandering, just arrival and no sound. Not even the raven, who had vanished again from the wall. Doria shut the door without calling out. She turned to Petros first. They came during the fog, she said. Petros closed his scroll and said nothing. He didn't need to. Downstairs, Marcian had begun humming under his breath. Not a song, a ward. Something his mother taught him when he was young and afraid, and the wind howled through broken windows. It didn't keep the fear away, but it made it rhythmic, predictable. Something to carry between breaths. Vilia came down from the corridor. Not long after, she was dressed in a cloak they hadn't given her, dark blue thing, finely made, with a faded bronze clasp in the shape of a sea lily. No one knew where she'd found it. No one asked. She walked with bare feet across the cold stone, but her steps made no sound. When she reached the hearth, she sat beside Lydian again and whispered. Something he didn't repeat. The rest of the day unfolded slowly, like snow falling in a locked garden. Tasks were done. Food was warmed. Walls were walked. But no one laughed. No one played. Even the smallest gestures, passing a cup, moving a stool, were done with care, with reverence, as though the air around them had become a sacred space. It was Petros who broke the stillness after sunset. He came into the great hall with a bundle of books wrapped in cloth and laid them gently on the table near the fire. From the lower library, he said. Forgotten, not burned. Doria came. Forward, then Talia, then Marcian. Lydian craned his neck to see. Petros unwrapped the cloth. Inside were 3 volumes, bound in lambskin, yellowed with age, but dry and intact. The title on the first was written in Greek, so old it looked etched in dust. Petros traced it with one trembling finger. Shornika. Istorano. Chronicle of the Sky. He opened the cover. The first page held only a single line. In silence, they descend. In silence, they awaken. The old towers remember. The room went still again. Lydian's voice broke the silence. What towers? Petros. Turned the page. The script became smaller. Diagrams followed strange constellations. Maps of stars that didn't match the ones above the citadel. Notes in margins written by different hands. Some crossed out, others underlined with trembling lines. And there, midway through the first chapter, a drawing, a structure, a tall, narrow spire, with no door, no windows, and a sharp apex, like a thorn. Around it, snow, fog, trees, silence. Velia stood then. She looked at the page without speaking, without blinking. Petros looked to her. You've seen it. Velia's voice was low. It's where I woke up. She stepped back, walked to the shuttered window. They sang inside it, but not with mouths. No one moved. She turned back to them. They were tall, thin. Their faces had no eyes, but they saw. Their hands never touched, but they reached. They speak without sound, and their words stay inside you, like embers. Talia sat down. Marcian stared at the fire. Doria watched Velia carefully. They brought you here, she asked. Velia shook her head. I followed them. A silence fell again. Not from fear this time. From awe. Petros turned the pages slowly, each one revealing more symbols, some etched in what looked like iron dust, others painted in ochre. Among them were images of towers, each different, scattered across maps that looked only vaguely like the coastline they knew. One tower stood among dunes, another beside a sea of ice, a third beneath a blackened sky with 3 moons, then one marked with a faded circle, near a river, near the sea, near the place where the citadel now stood. There, Velia whispered. Doria stepped closer. That's here. Velia nodded. It was buried. She pointed to a symbol beside it. They built the walls around it, to keep it asleep. Talia whispered. Did it wake? Velia closed her eyes. I think it's listening. That night, the wind returned, but not from the sea, nor from the forest. It rose from the earth, from beneath the citadel, low at first, like breath through a hollow pipe, then higher, like a whisper between stone cracks. It moved through the walls, not against them travelled the old passageways, climbed the inner staircases, reached into the chapel and down into the crypts, and beneath the great hall, deep beyond. The sealed gate no one had opened in a generation. Something stirred, not a sound, a pulse. Velia stood in the center of the floor. She placed one hand on the stone, then looked up and smiled. The stone was warm. No one could explain it. Doria had tested it first, placing her bare hand flat against the floor, in the exact spot Velia had stood the night before. Not warm like a hearth or the sun, but not cold like it should have been. The citadel's stones, after so many nights of frost, should have bitten against skin like ice. But this one pulsed, faintly, a rhythm too slow for any heartbeat, too steady for a draft, too alive to ignore. Petros brought his scrolls again. He laid them in careful spirals across the floor, drawing lines between symbols, sketching diagrams. That made no sense to the others, but seemed to quiet something in his mind. He muttered dates, recited lunar cycles, measured the width of the light falling through the eastern shutters. The sun was shifting faster than it should. The snow melted unevenly now. There was a dampness creeping through the mortar joints, and the candles burned with thin, stretched flames that reached toward the ceiling as if begging to be extinguished. Did not speak again that day. She ate. She watched the windows. She sat beside Lydian and helped him line up the wooden animals into unfamiliar patterns, 3 in a row. Then 2, then a space, then the lion alone. She hummed once, a strange, low note that made the dog bark and then whimper, tail tucked, eyes wide. After that, no one sang. Marcian tried to bolt the crypt gate. The hinges shrieked. The lock refused. Even with the extra iron loop he forged himself in the old smith room, it wouldn't seal. Something in the shape of the metal bent every time. He tried to pin it, not with heat, with resistance, as if the stone itself pushed back. So instead he pushed a cupboard in front of it, then an empty barrel, then a crate full of salt. He said nothing, but when he passed Doria in the hallway afterward, he pressed a dried heather bundle into her hand without a word and kept walking. They burned it before sunset. That night, the hearth flame refused to bank. No matter how carefully Doria buried the embers, they stirred again. Petros came and tried himself. Ash in neat mounds, kindling arranged like wings folded. Still, the red heart pulsed back to life. Velia said, "Let it burn." So they did. The firelight danced against the frescoes of the chapel until midnight. Then, one by one, the figures painted on the walls began to fade, not vanish, not peel, but soften. The golden eyes of the saints dimmed, as though they had turned their gaze inward. The halos blurred. The shadows of their robes deepened. Petros saw it first. Then Ismin, then Talia, who covered her mouth and whispered a prayer she hadn't used since her father's burial. By morning, the snow had melted in a perfect ring around the chapel. 10 paces wide, circular. Circular, as if the ground itself had exhaled heat. From beneath, the earth steamed, but the air remained bitter cold. Doria stood at the threshold, hand on the old wooden door, and watched the mist curl upward from the soil like breath from a sleeping creature. "They're waking," said Velia. Petros asked, "Who are they?" Velia answered, "Not people." In the cellar beneath the south hall, the old jars began to crack. The pickled pears, the dried olives, the resin-sealed pots of honey that hadn't been opened in 5 winters. Each split open, not from mold, not from pressure, but from within, as though the contents had turned against the container. Marcian swept up the shards. The honey smelled like iron. The olives bled black. Lydian found feathers in the stairwell. Not bird feathers, something else. Long, thin, almost transparent, like strands of frost that had taken wing. They melted on touch, left no trace but a sharp, citrus-like scent that clung to his fingertips for hours. And on the wall above the hearth, a crack appeared. Just one, straight down the center of the stone. Velia touched it. It hummed that afternoon. Petros gathered them. All he spread the last of the books across the great table, pages trembling in the draftless room. The citadel was not built to guard, he said. It was built to seal. They stared. He turned a page. This tower, this place, sits marked, in the oldest texts, as phalanx. The guardian, not a fortress. A plug, a lock. Talia whispered, "A lock for what?" He didn't answer. Velia did. For them, she stepped into the center of the room. They came before language, before salt, before smoke. The towers were raised to lull them. The people forgot why. Only the walls remembered. Marcian scoffed, But he didn't laugh. Petros didn't argue. Talia cried, softly, and Doria took her hand. Lydian climbed onto the bench beside the old map and pointed at the river bend. There's another mark here. They all looked. Another circle, fainter. South of the citadel, Petros whispered, to towers. Velia nodded. They speak to each other when the fog returns. And that night, the fog did return. Heavier, it rolled in without wind. No cold, no snow, just a thick, humming veil that swallowed sound and blurred shape. Even the dogs wouldn't go outside. They paced, wind, hid beneath the tables and pressed against the hearth. And from within the mist came the first echo. It wasn't sound, not vibration, but pressure inside the skull, behind the ribs, like a name half remembered, pushed forward by a voice you couldn't place. It made everyone in the room stop moving at the same time. No cue, no command, just stillness, eyes wide, hands mid-motion, hearts pounding. Then it passed. No one spoke of it. No one had to. Velia walked to the window. The fog parted for her eyes, and beyond the gate, standing just beyond the reach of the torchlight, was a figure, tall, thin, no face, no breath, watching. Then it stepped backward and vanished. Doria shut the shutters. Petros began boiling sage. Marcian oiled the hinges of every door. And Velia curled beside the hearth, her hand still on the stone, her breath calm. They're listening, she whispered, but they haven't decided. The wind that rose that night carried no sound, only memory, old memory. The kind the walls kept pressed beneath layers of lime and plaster, buried beneath steps, sealed in wax, bound in scrolls. No, one reed dot, but now the seals cracked, and the citadel listened back. The stone was warm. No one could explain it. Doria had tested it first, placing her bare hand flat against the floor, in the exact spot Velia had stood the night before. Not warm like a hearth or the sun, but not cold like it should have been. The citadel's stones, after so many nights of frost, should have bitten against skin like ice. But this one pulsed, faintly, a rhythm too slow for any heartbeat, too steady for a draft, too alive to ignore. Petros brought his scrolls again. He laid them in careful spirals across the floor, drawing lines between symbols, sketching diagrams. That made no sense to the others, but seemed to quiet something in his mind. He muttered dates, recited lunar cycles, measured the width of the light falling through the eastern shutters. The sun was shifting faster than it should. The snow melted unevenly now. There was a dampness creeping through the mortar joints, and the candles burned with thin, stretched flames that reached toward the ceiling as if begging to be extinguished. Did not speak again that day. She ate. She watched the windows. She sat beside Lydian and helped him line up the wooden animals into unfamiliar patterns, 3 in a row. Then 2, then a space, then the lion alone. She hummed once, a strange, low note that made the dog bark and then whimper, tail tucked, eyes wide. After that, no one sang. Marcian tried to bolt the crypt gate. The hinges shrieked. The lock refused. Even with the extra iron loop he forged himself in the old smith room, it wouldn't seal. Something in the shape of the metal bent every time. He tried to pin it, not with heat, with resistance, as if the stone itself pushed back. So instead he pushed a cupboard in front of it, then an empty barrel, then a crate full of salt. He said nothing, but when he passed Doria in the hallway afterward, He pressed a dried heather bundle into her hand without a word and kept walking. They burned it before sunset. That night, the hearth flame refused to bank. No matter how carefully Doria buried the embers, they stirred again. Petros came and tried himself. Ash in neat mounds, kindling arranged like wings folded. Still, the red heart pulsed back to life. Velia said, "Let it burn." So they did. The firelight danced against the frescoes of the chapel until midnight. Then, one by one, the figures painted on the walls began to fade, not vanish, not peel, but soften. The golden eyes of the saints dimmed, as though they had turned their gaze inward. The halos blurred. The shadows of their robes deepened. Petros saw it first. Then Ismin, then Talia, who covered her mouth and whispered a prayer she hadn't used since her father's burial. By morning, the snow had melted in a perfect ring around the chapel. 10 paces wide, circular, circular, as if the ground itself had exhaled heat. From beneath, the earth steamed, but the air remained bitter cold. Doria stood at the threshold, hand on the old wooden door, and watched the mist curl upward from the soil like breath from a sleeping creature. "They're waking," said Velia. Petros asked, "Who are they?" Velia answered, "Not people." In the cellar beneath the south hall, the old jars began to crack. The pickled pears, the dried olives, the resin-sealed pots of honey that hadn't been opened in 5 winters. Each split open, not from mold, not from pressure, but from within, as though the contents had turned against the container. Marcian swept up the shards. The honey smelled like iron. The olives bled black. Lydian found feathers in the stairwell. Not bird feathers, something else. Long, thin, almost transparent, like strands of frost that had taken wing. They melted on touch, left no trace but a sharp, citrus-like scent that clung to his fingertips for hours. And on the wall above the hearth, a crack appeared. Just one, straight down the center of the stone. Velia touched it. It hummed that afternoon. Petros gathered them. All he spread the last of the books across the great table, pages trembling in the draftless room. The citadel was not built to guard, he said. It was built to seal. They stared. He turned a page. This tower, this place, sits marked, in the oldest texts, as phalanx. The guardian, not a fortress. A plug, a lock. Talia whispered, "A lock for what?" He didn't answer. Velia did. For them, she stepped into the center of the room. They came before language, before salt, before smoke. The towers were raised to lull them. The people forgot why. Only the walls remembered. Marcian scoffed, but he didn't laugh. Petros didn't argue. Talia cried, softly, and Doria took her hand. Lydian climbed onto the bench beside the old map and pointed at the river bend. "There's another mark here." They all looked. Another circle, fainter. "South of the citadel," Petros whispered, "to towers." Velia nodded. "They speak to each other when the fog returns." And that night, the fog did return. Heavier, it rolled in without wind. No cold, no snow, just a thick, humming veil that swallowed sound and blurred shape. Even the dogs wouldn't go outside. They paced, wind, hid beneath the tables and pressed against the hearth. And from within the mist came the first echo. It wasn't sound, not vibration, but pressure inside the skull, behind the ribs, like a name half remembered, pushed forward by a voice you couldn't place. It made everyone in the room stop moving at the same time. No cue, no command, just stillness, eyes wide, hands mid-ocean, hearts pounding, then it passed. No one spoke of it, no one had to. Velia walked to the window. The fog parted for her eyes, and beyond the gate, standing just beyond the reach of the torchlight, was a figure, tall, thin, no face, no breath, watching. Then it stepped backward and vanished. Doria shut the shutters. Petros began boiling sage. Marcian oiled the hinges of every door, and Velia curled beside the hearth, her hand still on the stone, her breath calm. "They're listening," she whispered, "but they haven't decided." The wind that rose that night carried no sound, only memory, old memory, the kind the walls kept pressed beneath layers of lime and plaster, buried beneath steps, sealed in wax, bound in scrolls, no one reed dot. But now the seals cracked, and the citadel listened back. The fog did not lift for 3 days. It moved as though it lived, drifting through doorways without permission, clinging to the windows, knotting itself between the ironwork on the outer gate. No one stepped outside. Not even the goats dared. Near the courtyard, their hooves uncertain on the stone, their eyes wild and silent, the chickens huddled together beneath the stairs. Even the sparrows that once pecked by the water troughs vanished from the eaves. Petros had begun sleeping with the scrolls. He didn't say why. They were brittle and yellowing, and none of them could read the older script save for him, but each night he laid them out beside his makeshift bed and touched the ink with 2 fingers before he closed his eyes, as though anchoring himself to something older than fear. The rest of them understood without asking. Even Doria stopped questioning. Talia no longer braided her hair. She stood at the chapel wall each morning, tracing the blurring frescoes with her fingertips. The faces of the saints were fading entirely now, not peeling, not chipped, gone. The colors bled into one another like water on parchment. The eyes vanished first, then the mouths. The halos shrank. One figure in the center, the angel with the bronze sword, was now just a smudge of gold, almost like the shape of a flame before. Wind catches it. Velia stopped speaking altogether. She no longer needed to. Everyone began to feel her thoughts before she voiced them. When she walked to the hearth, they knew to clear a space. When she sat by the crack in the stone, they knew not to speak. When she hummed, no one breathed. Lydian followed her now, not like a child following a guardian, but like a page follows. A queen, eyes lowered, hands still, waiting. Doria, for her part, kept the rhythm of the days. She boiled water each morning, swept the stones, washed the blankets, not because she thought it mattered, but because the rhythm itself mattered. If the room still held motion, perhaps the walls would remember what they were. If the windows still opened, perhaps the sun would find them again. But the sun hadn't touched the citadel in days. The fog grew thicker. It pooled in the corners now, even inside the hall. Not smoke, not mist, something denser, like a memory trapped in fabric. It had weight. They felt it when they walked through the chapel. Their hands brushed it in the kitchen. Their eyes stung when they stood too long by the sealed stairwell to the crypts. The hearth never died. The flame didn't roar. It didn't flicker. It simply held steady, constant, a thin tongue of golden fire that curved slightly to the east no matter the wind. Even when the shutters were closed, the flame leaned. When they tried to bank it beneath ash, it resisted. When Velia stood beside it, it straightened again. That night, she drew a shape in the ash with her finger. Not a word, not a symbol, just a circle with 5 smaller circles inside, arranged like a flower. Petros recognized it. He opened the 3rd volume. It was a seal, not one of binding, one of invitation. Why would they want it opened? Talia asked. Velia looked at her. They don't want. Her voice was thinner now. They wait. Beneath the citadel, the pulse grew stronger. They heard it in the walls, now not a sound, not a vibration, but something behind the silence, like the way you can feel thunder before it reaches the ground. Marcian began carving small talismans from the old beam shapes his grandfather taught him during plague seasons. He didn't tell the others what they meant, but he placed them in thresholds, above the larder door, at the foot of the bedchamber stairs, and around the circle Velia had drawn by the fire. Doria helped him hang a sprig of rohan over the chapel door. It withered by morning. No one touched the outer gate, but they all began to hear footsteps just beyond it. Not always, only near dusk. A slow pacing. 4 steps. Pause. For more. Always just far enough that the torchlight couldn't reach, but close enough that it echoed slightly on the old stones. Lydian swore he saw a flicker of blue where the figure should have been pale blue, not like fabric, but like a candle burning behind smoke. Petros opened a new page. This one wasn't parchment, it was vellum, dark with age, the ink more like shadow than pigment. There was no language, only symbols arranged in vertical columns. At the bottom of the page, a simple sketch, a tower half sunken into the earth, its tip cracked, from which a black vine or tendril seemed to rise. Is this ours? Marcian asked. Petros nodded. Before the citadel, before anything, the first. Stone, and beneath it, something still moving. No one asked how he knew. No one asked what the black vine was, because that night, the dreams returned. All of them dreamt the same thing, the same tower, the same fog, the same soundless voice humming through ribs and skull like a song played inside bone. In the dream, they stood at the threshold of a spiral stair, impossibly narrow, impossibly deep, and at the bottom not fire, not light, but a mirror. In the mirror, each of them saw something different. Doria saw a wall of hands, pressed outward. Petros saw an open eye, buried in salt. Talia saw her own mouth moving, but no sound coming. Marcian saw a child asleep in snow, and Velia saw nothing at all. She smiled in the dream, and when they woke, she was standing again by the crack in the hearthstone. Eyes open, still smiling. The fog had finally entered the hall. It moved, slowly, across the floor, curling around. Their feet, tasting the air. Not cold, not warm. It had no temperature at all. It simply was. And in its wake, the walls darkened. Not stain shifted. The grey of stone turned slightly blue, then slightly black, and then something deeper, like the colour of an eclipse. Symbols began to etch themselves into the walls quietly, almost apologetically, as if the stone remembered how to write. Velia traced one with her fingertip. It glowed briefly, and behind her, the sealed stairwell to the crypts breathed. Not opened, not broke, breathed, a single exhale, long and low, like the sigh of something very old waking from something very deep. Lydian took Velia's hand. She whispered to him. He didn't cry, he only nodded, then turned and went to gather the small wooden lion from beside the fire. Petros was already packing the scrolls. Doria began boiling more water. Talia reached for the rohan again, even though it had already crumbled, and Marcian checked the blade of the old sickle knot, because he thought it would help. but because hands need something to hold when they tremble. Velia looked at the stairwell, then back at them. "It's listening," she said again, "but now it remembers." And the citadel, long silent, long still, long forgotten by sun and city and sea, held its breath again and waited. They didn't speak the next morning, not from fear, not from custom. There were simply no words left that felt weighty enough to rise above the silence. The kind of silence that thickens around thought, pressing against teeth and tongue like a second skin. It had snowed again, though none had seen it fall. The courtyard was white, perfectly smooth, undisturbed. No prints, no melt, no wind. The snow had simply appeared, like dust on forgotten shelves, or ash after a long sleep. Lydian sat at the chapel threshold with the wooden lion in his lap. The lion had changed. No one carved it, no one painted it, but the eyes were darker now, more alert. The mane was detailed in a way it hadn't been before, reach line sharper, deeper, as though time had etched it by hand. Velia noticed. She said nothing. Petros hadn't slept. His eyes were hollow with ink and candlelight. The scrolls were thinner now, too many pages removed. He'd started writing on the backs of old ledger books and the walls near the south window. Strange symbols, mostly curves. Some resembled waves, others the spiraling seed pods Doria remembered from her mother's garden, back in a village whose name she no longer bothered to recall. Talia stopped tending the bread. She didn't mean to. She just couldn't remember the order of things anymore. What came first? What to knead? How long to wait? The fire wouldn't bake it anyway. The hearth no longer produced heat, only light. The flame burned silently, colorless now, not gold, not orange, just a pale shimmer like moonlight spilled into oil. Marcian tried to cook a turnip over it. It stayed cold. The spiral appeared beneath the stair. No one carved it. They found it there one morning, spiraling inward, etched shallowly into the stone at the base of the crypt steps. 5 rings, a 6th, smaller at the center. Doria bent too. Touch it. The moment her fingers brushed the edge, she heard the voice again, not outside, not above inside her bones. It didn't speak in words. It pressed meaning into her shoulders, her knees, the roots of her teeth. A suggestion, a longing, like remembering a song you've never heard, or waking up with someone else's dream still caught in your throat. She stepped back. Velia walked forward. She stood at the spiral's edge and simply waited. The stones pulsed. Marcian laid down his sickle. Talia took her hand, and the stairwell opened, not suddenly, not with sound. The seal crumbled like a paper wall, left in rain slowly, gently, without fanfare. The steps that lay beneath were older than the tower itself, carved from stone so dark it seemed to drink the light. Moss curled around their edges, but not green-black moss, soft and shimmering, breathing gently in and out like fur asleep. The cold that rose from below wasn't winter. It was older, colder, the kind of cold that forgets names, that erases breath, that smooths the edges of memory like a river rubbing down stone. But no one stepped back. No one cried out. They had known, even before they remembered, that the steps would open, that they would be walked. Petros was the first to descend, not because he was brave, because he could know, longer endure not knowing. Each step echoed, but the echo did not return the same sound. He stepped. He heard another step, then another, as if someone walked beside him, behind him, within him. Doria followed with a candle, though its light barely held. Marcian, then Talia, then Lydian with the lion tucked into his tunic. Velia came last. She didn't bring a torch. She didn't bring a charm. She walked as if she knew where she was going. The descent was slow. The air shifted with each spiral, not growing thicker but quieter. Sounds dulled, breaths muffled. Even thought became slower, as though filtered through a dense mist that curled between synapses. And all along the walls, more of the spirals, dot-drawn, etched, growing larger the deeper they went, until finally the stair ended. They stepped into a chamber with no ceiling. The stars above them were wrong. Too many, too close, too sharp. They didn't twinkle. They watched. Petros looked up and wept, not from fear, from recognition. These stars, he whispered, are beneath the earth. The chamber was round, the stone walls lined with shelves. On each shelf, a vessel, clay, bone, bronze, none of them identical. Some were carved, some wrapped in cloth, some sealed with wax. And at the center, a stone basin, dry, empty, yet glistening as though freshly rinsed. Velia stepped toward it. The others did not follow. She placed her hand on the basin's edge, and slowly water appeared. Not poured, not summoned, revealed, clear, perfectly still, lit from beneath by a light that wasn't light at all. When Velia looked into it, her eyes went blank. No color, no reflection, just silence. Then a name. None of them heard it, but each one knew it. And with that knowing came memory. Talia saw the field again, the one with the poplars. Before the fire, Marcian smelled his mother's bread, the one with cinnamon. They only baked on solstice. Doria felt the weight of her first child in her arms again. Though she had buried him 20 winters ago, Lydian closed his eyes and whispered something that sounded like a lullaby in a language no one had taught him, and Petros saw the stars fall, not in the sky, in his chest, and the basin began to overflow. The water spilled silently onto the stone, curling toward the shelves, touching the vessels, and the vessels began to hum. Not music, not noise, just vibration. Recognition, Velia, stepped back. The hum grew louder. The chamber itself began to pulse, not shaking, not trembling, breathing, like lungs exhaling after centuries held tight. The vessels sang, not voices, not language, a frequency, pure, clear, sharp enough to cut silence, and from the walls. The moss rose, not like plants, like memory. It unfurled, reaching, trembling slightly in the resonance of the vessel's hum. And then, from behind the basin, a door opened, not into another room, into another time. The light that poured through it was not light, it was memory, thick and radiant and endless. Doria saw herself as a child, feet bare in rain, laughing. Petros saw a city of silver spires beneath 2 moons. Marcian saw a man who looked like him, whispering into stone. Talia saw her brother's hand, reaching across a river of mist. Lydian saw nothing, and smiled. Velia stepped through the door. She did not look back. She did not speak. She simply vanished, and in her place, the lion began to glow, softly, warmly, a heartbeat. Lydian touched it. The hum stopped. The chamber fell still. The water receded. The moss folded in. The vessels stilled. The stars above blinked out, and the stair behind them remained open. They did not speak. They did not cry. They simply climbed, one by one, back toward the surface. When they emerged, the citadel was unchanged. But the snow had melted. The air was warmer. The hearth flame had turned gold again. The frescoes were gone, but in their place, a new figure. Not a saint, not an angel, a girl, eyes closed, hand raised, a lion at her feet, and above her head, the spiral hole still waiting. No one left the citadel, not because they couldn't, because they no longer wished to. The gates had not been locked. The snow had melted clean down to stone. Birds had returned, quiet birds with dark wings and sharp black eyes, roosting on rooftops, blinking without fear. The goats resumed their stubborn circles in the courtyard, stamping in patterns no one recognized, as though trying to remember something buried in hooves. The city below had forgotten them, or perhaps it had never truly known them. No messengers came, no soldiers, no taxman with dried ink and missing teeth, just wind and light, and the slow sighing of time making its way back into the cracks between cobblestones. Inside, the rhythm shifted, not broken. Rewritten. The hearth no longer struggled. It sang faintly in gold light and the occasional pop of sap within pine logs. Bread baked again. The scent of cloves hung in the kitchen, though no one remembered grinding them. The tapestries, once dull and moth-eaten, began to change, thread by thread, color by color, unfurling scenes none had woven, of silver towers and spiraled wells, of winged figures and lions sleeping beneath trees of ash. Talia traced them each. Morning her fingers found stories in the threads. Some she read aloud, others she only whispered. She did not remember all the names, but she remembered their songs. Petros did not return to his books. He walked instead, slowly, room by room, pressing his palm to each wall, each lintel, each stone. He said the citadel was remembering too, and that each touch helped it remember. A little more clearly. Sometimes he sang low, ancient tunes in a tongue none of them had ever heard aloud, yet all somehow recognized. When he walked the corridors, the torches lit on their own. Doria began growing herbs, not in pots, in the cracks of the inner courtyard. No one planted them. They simply rose between stone and mortar, green and stubborn. She smiled when she saw them. Sage, thyme, and a purple blossom she swore hadn't existed since her grandmother's grandmother had named it for protection. She let it grow wild. Mark Ion stood guard, though there were no longer enemies. He walked the walls at sunrise. Sickle, now rusted and repurposed as a crescent, hung on his belt knot. A weapon, a reminder. Sometimes he paused to hum the tune Velia once whispered to Lydian. Sometimes he listened to the wind instead, and Lydian. He no longer carried the lion. He didn't need to. It followed him now, not on feet, but in light, a flicker, golden and warm, that moved just behind him wherever he went. It did not speak, it did not roar, but when he lay down at night, it curled beside him like a shadow shaped in kindness. The others saw it only from the corner of their eyes, but that was enough. Velia never returned, not in body, but her name remained, etched softly into the chapel wall, beneath the new fresco of the girl with the lion and the spiral crown. No one chiseled it. It appeared one morning, as though breathed onto stone by memory itself, and the stairs to the chamber below, never sealed, they remained open, lit by nothing, yet never dark. None descended. Again, not from fear, from reverence, because some paths need only be walked once for the remembering to hold. The citadel no longer whispered. It hummed, quietly, always, beneath the sound of boots on stone and spoons in bowls and breath in sleep. A note so low it became part of everything: wall, floor, skin, dream. Visitors would have called it silence, but those who lived there knew better. It was the sound of the deep, remembering the tomb of old things made new without losing their name. On the final night of winter, the stars turned once more. No one marked the exact hour. No bell was rung, no torch lit, but each one of them woke at the same moment, stepped onto the roof, looked upward, and saw it. Not a comet, not a moon, a spiral of light, vast and slow, unfolding itself across the sky like a hand remembering how to open. At its center, no color, no heat, just a stillness so complete that every breath seemed to echo inside it. They didn't speak. They stood shoulder to shoulder and simply watched. Beneath them, the citadel exhaled, not a sigh of weariness, a breath of peace, of fullness, of cycle complete. And in that breath, they knew the story was not ending, only closing its eyes for a while. The lion slept at Lydian's feet. Petros rested his hand on the stones. Talia hummed a melody no longer forgotten. Marcian smiled and did not hide it. Doria closed her eyes, and somewhere deep below, the vessels in the spiral chamber quieted their hum. Still, whole, listening, ready.